Good afternoon. I am Dr. Mark Moyer of the CSIS project on military and diplomatic history, which is excited to be hosting this event in conjunction with the International Security Program. I'm also today's fire marshal, so I can tell you if in the event of a fire, you go out these doors, down the stairs, go outside, make two lefts till you get to the National Geographic Society building. For those of you who haven't been to our events before, we promote the use of history in helping us understand current national security challenges. We have a lot of events. If you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up on the CSIS website. And the event we have today is a great example of the type of history that we like to promote. Some of you came to an earlier event we did on the Thucydides trap by Graham Allison, and if you weren't there, you probably have still heard that he looks at a number of historical cases of a rising power that challenges the hegemon, and he was, of course, looking in particular at China. But we also know that while war may be likely in that scenario, it's not inevitable. And today's author has gone into great depth on one of the, perhaps the most important of the exceptions where the rise of the one power did not in fact result in a huge war with the hegemon. And you can gather which case that is from the title of the book, which is Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. This is a copy of the book, just fresh off the press from Harvard University Press. It's very provocative, incisive, a compelling book. If you haven't read it already, I would urge you to get a copy as quickly as you can and read it. So I'm going to introduce our speaker today and our discussant, and then we'll turn things over to them. So the author of the book, Dr. Kori Schake, is a distinguished research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She teaches thinking about war at Stanford as a contributing editor at The Atlantic, and also writes for War on the Rocks and Foreign Policy. She's also co-edited with Secretary of Defense James Mattis the book Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. I've had the privilege of getting to know her through a program at the Hoover Institution called the Working Group on Military History and Contemporary Conflict, which, like this program, it looks at how we can use military history to understand the present. They focus heavily on written products. If you go to their Strategica website, you can see some great stuff. We here are focused on events. Dr. Shake's also served in a wide variety of policy roles, from the National Security Council to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the State Department's policy planning staff. During the 2008 presidential election, she was senior policy advisor on the McCain-Palin campaign. She also has a brand new position, which probably most of you weren't aware of yet, but she's about to become the deputy director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. So congratulations on your new position, as well as the new book. Exciting times. And moderating the discussion will be Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who is Senior Vice President, Henry A. Kissinger Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at CSIS. And she's concurrently the Donald Marin Scholar at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Before coming to CSIS, she served as Principal Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kori Schake.
Well, Kori, thank you so much for coming to do this today. I loved the book. I thought it was, as with everything you do, superbly written, really fascinating read, and I want to dive in with you directly, and then we'll turn it over so the audience can ask some questions. But why don't we start very broadly with you giving us a sense of why you came at this topic, how you define it, and a quick summary of where you end up on the issue of the transition from British to U.S. hegemony.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Kath. It's a great privilege to be in your company, my friend.
Yeah,
I got started on the book because with all the discussion, all the talk about the rise of China and what does it mean for the United States and can it happen peacefully, I got curious about other transitions. And Graham Allison is wrong. There is only one hegemonic transition that happens peacefully, and that is Britain to the United States in the 19th century. Graham uses a lot of regional transitions where the United States was nonetheless the security guarantor, and I think that's what throws his numbers off. So I didn't realize actually that there was only one peaceful transition when I got started writing the book. I was surprised to find that out, and so went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand why it happened peacefully. And what I look at, I don't just, it's intellectually a hard subject to get traction on about how do you judge one country's waning power and another country's flowing power, and how do you do it in a way that takes the culture into account. The way that I chose to do it was to look at the definition of hegemony as who sets and enforces the rules, right? So what makes a country a hegemon isn't they're the richest country or they have the largest army. It's who sets the rules and who enforces the rules. And so I started the book in 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine, which many of you may know, but I did not when I started writing the book, was actually a British proposal to the United States for us to do this jointly, and looked at how the tale unfolded of American efforts to change the rules that Britain had established. And so I look at 9 inflection points in the course of the book across 100 years that tell the story about American efforts to change the rules and British reactions to them. And then I close the book by looking at what does this tell us about China? And I'll start with the bad news, which is the Anglo-American transition was both a highly contentious and a highly contingent one. Namely, there are lots of ways this could have gone bad. And for two countries that have so much commonality, culturally, politically, religiously, linguistically, this was still a very close run thing. And the second thing, so that's the bad news. The second element of it is that what makes for a peaceful transition between Britain and the United States is in the 1870s, the US, because of westward expansion, comes to think of ourselves in imperial terms. And Britain, because of the peaceful expansion of their political franchise, becomes democratic. And so by the 1870s, we look similar to each other and different from everyone else. And that sense of similarity creates the space for political compromise and crisis. And the sense of similarity isn't governments determining their national interest. It's the societies, the political cultures come into alignment. And let me just give one quick example, which is that during the time where warfare was closest between Britain and the United States, the 1895 Venezuelan debt crisis, Grover Cleveland, the American president, gets a unanimous declaration of Congress supporting his policy of going to war with Britain. A unanimous congressional declaration that we're going to fight a country that would unquestionably have won that war. Right? What prevents it happening is American newspapers start soliciting for British letters of support and fraternity. And they get thousands of them, including from the Prince of Wales, the husband of Queen Victoria, saying that war between these two countries would be fratricide. And 354 members of the British House of Parliament appeal to their American counterparts to forever after solve problems by arbitration between our countries rather than war. So it's not the governments are making peaceful choices, it's that the societies are. And they're both representative societies by that point in time. Which takes me to the present moment.
Yes.
I am deeply skeptical that if this China continues to rise, that any transition will happen peacefully. Because I don't think there's the sense of sameness that creates policy space for compromise in crisis. The good news is, though, I think it likelier than not that this China cannot continue to grow more powerful and prosperous without also liberalizing. So it's not a totally dark horizon that we are looking at, but it's going to be dicey.
Well, I do want to come back to the China issue and the present, but I'll start back as you do. You mentioned before the Monroe Doctrine maybe not being as familiar to you as you had wanted it to be before you started the book. I definitely can say that about the Venezuelan debt crisis of 1895. I knew nothing prior. If I did, I don't recall it prior to this book. But fascinating, because you do talk in the book, you go across these 9 case studies, but that is more than any other case, essentially your turning point case of where, as you put it, at least the first time you can really see. It's either the point at which these changes have accumulated or it's the point at which it changes, but that's where you really start to see this shift. You also have a theme that I want to draw out with regard to this case, and you can broaden it, where you talk about it has as much to do with how the British see themselves as it does with how the US sees itself, which of course has meaning going forward. So how were the British thinking through, for instance, this case study, and what had really changed for them?
Thank you for asking that question. It's such a fun framing of the issue. For the British, at the start of this process, the United States is what Britain does not want to become, right? That a country run by non-entities and demagogues, right? A British historian of that period describes the United States as a group of people too extreme in their religion or politics or both to live in peace where they came from. Right? Charles Dickens, the novelist traveling through the United States, describes the United States as more barbaric than the Indian cultures it had subdued. Right? They don't want to be us. And in particular, the political elites don't want to be us. And in their defense, the United States is an illiberal democracy in very many ways in the 19th century. What is so beautiful about the American trajectory as a hegemon is that as we grow stronger, we grow more liberal. And that's not been the case for previous hegemons. So what we look like to the British is something they absolutely don't want to be. But the inevitable pressures of the Industrial Revolution, which starts in Britain and creates a nouveau riche in cities like Manchester, and they don't have political representation. So the pressures on the British government. American foreign policy plays into this in important ways because in all of these cases, the British government actually has to be nervous about what their own population is going to think about policy choices that are injurious to the United States. And the reason they have to be concerned, and this is so beautiful, is because who we are as a representative political culture and who we are as an immigrant society. We tend to think of our polyglot immigrant America as a vulnerability in warfare. But in fact, during the American Civil War, when Britain had its greatest opportunity to strike a blow to prevent American power from burgeoning, they were the strongest power in the international order was restrained by the fact that they had to worry about how much harder it would be to control Ireland and Scotland if they moved against the United States by recognizing the Confederacy. Because by 1860, the predominance of British immigrants to the United States came from Ireland and Scotland, and they went to the industrialized North. And so the familial linkages, the sense of opportunity in the United States, Britain had to worry about that as a domestic constraint on their own foreign policy choices. And I'm a little bit hopeful that with 350,000 Chinese students in the United States every year, that sooner or later that conveyor belt may also begin to constrain Chinese government choices. I don't think it does anytime soon, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, well, let's talk about one of the strains that maybe you could argue, goes a little more from the liberal to illiberal, or from the liberal to realpolitik on the US side, which is the whole strain throughout your cases and history of the US approach to the Western Hemisphere, which is, you pick up in a variety of your cases, the Venezuela debt crisis, where the Venezuelans default on their debt and European powers want to go in and force repayment, and the US gets involved there, the Spanish-American War, the Oregon dispute. Can you talk, so the US starts with this very sort of policy of nobody touch the Western Hemisphere, but they end up in a very different place, you argue. Can you talk about that strain?
Yeah, it's discouraging, right? So the US starts with the Monroe Doctrine on the idealistic argument that these societies emerging from Spanish and Portuguese colonial control deserved to be free. And our experience of involvement in those countries, particularly after the Spanish-American War, right? One of the reasons the Spanish-American War is seminal in America's development as a great power is within the space of a year, we persuade ourselves to shift from the Platt Amendment, right? Congress constraining the president's ability to intervene in Cuba by saying that they will only agree to it if we do not exercise any colonial control in the country, right? Very noble, very American values writ large. A year later, the Teller Amendment passes, excuse me, I've got it backwards, that refuses Cuba any political development independent of American control, right? So very quickly we compromise the integrity of our principles. And what the British bet at that point in time is that the United States will become a traditional great power. That is, we will behave like every other colonial overlord. And they're right for about 20 years. But it doesn't remain true, right? By the 1920s, the US is recalibrating its relationship with the Latin American countries in a way that fosters their continued political development. But the British are right for the seminal 20 years of time that the US is no better than anybody else in our behavior in the Philippines, in our behavior in Cuba, in our behavior in Honduras, and other places.
Do you think that you can come away from this book if you're looking at it from the British side and think this is a wonderful example of how to adapt to, and in some small ways maybe co-opt the rising hegemon to peacefully execute the things you want to get out of the international system? Or you could look at it from them as a series of opportunities lost to remain the hegemon. And as we jump ahead to the China-US piece, where do you fall, if you will, on how we should think about, is it opportunities lost, or is it the ability to shape that most motivates you?
That's a wonderful question. So leaving the current administration aside, I think the 4 previous American administrations had it just about right, which is to encourage the Chinese that it is in their interest to opt into the existing order. That is, the rules that are established benefit you. And as long as you play by the rules, we're not afraid of a powerful, prosperous China. But we are afraid of a powerful, prosperous China that is illiberal and that doesn't play by the rules. And those 4 American presidents have hedged their bets against China opting to change the rules. What the British did so brilliantly is they were indulgent when we were making reckless, early, brazen choices. Mm-hmm.
And you pointed out earlier, but just to put a fine point on it, at a point at which they were militarily and economically able, if they had so chosen, to defeat the United States. And we were mouthing off, if you will. We were talking well beyond our abilities.
It is hard not to read this history and be incredibly sympathetic to Britain's exasperation with the United States, right? Like
we're big talkers, yeah.
In the Venezuelan debt crisis in 1895, the American Navy in the Caribbean was comprised of 6 ships, right? We had 6 maritime vessels in the region, and we threatened the Royal Navy with a fight. Moreover, the American Secretary of State fires off this 12,000-word diplomatic note to the British that concludes with us saying, American law is fiat upon this continent, right? And the British write back and point out that Britain actually controls more territory in North America than the United States does. So the patience that they had in dealing with us when we were unruly really is an important lesson, right? They played a long game. Mm-hmm. They looked at the growing convergence of both interests and values and bet that they could win this game. And for the seminal 20 years, they were right. But what they had wrong, which is what makes me worried about a rising China, is that the United States, once it was comfortably the dominant power in the international order, actually even before it was comfortably, right? You see it with Wilson's 14 points, determining the terms on which the United States will join World War I. You see it with Wilson's negotiation of the Versailles Treaty. You see it with the Washington Naval Accords in 1923. You especially see it written writ large in the international order the United States creates after 1945, which is we create an order that is a macrocosm of our domestic political order. And I think that is the way to bet your money on what China will do as well.
Yeah, and just to quote you on exactly this point, I thought this was a great way to put it. Future hegemons, no matter how much commonality they exhibit through the passage of power from one state to another, will eventually seek to remake the international order in their own image. So back to the question of how might China be thinking about, if as it rises, how it might be thinking about that macrocosm. Do you have thoughts on the areas to most watch if you're the United States in that sense?
Well, it seems to me that China is already exhibiting that behavior all over the place in the East and South China Seas, with a desire to impose on smaller, weaker countries outcomes those countries do not want. Mm-hmm. You see it with China trying to wean itself off treasuries as the store of future value for their economy. I think you see it in the way that the Chinese are trying to assist undemocratic governments. I think you see it in the way the Chinese are investing in other countries without fostering the development of those countries or caring about the political circumstance in the country. And I think the likeliest backlash against the One Belt, One Road initiative is going to be for countries that can't pay the loans to China, get their ports or rail lines seized, and then rise up violently against the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are behaving like United Fruit in Honduras in the 1930s. We know what that outcome looks like. The Chinese ought to know what that outcome looks like, but they are internationalizing their domestic model.
Yeah. I know there are going to be a lot of great questions on these. These are great points. I do want to come briefly to the issue of military history, because I thought you were great about noting early in the book what I think everyone in the room knows. The practice of writing history has trended away from wars in recent decades. Yet the question of how the international order reacted to a country growing in strength and activism that challenged the prevailing rules of the established order cannot be answered without relying heavily on the force of arms and its related foreign policy choices. Do you have hope, I guess I would say, that as the United States enters and the world enters what appears to be a pretty destabilizing period, that there is a turn toward history and military history specifically to help us understand and look for answers?
Yes, I both think that if you don't read history, so I should start by saying that my PhD dissertation was a history, and it was funded by a shady four-nation research consortium that was looking into nuclear weapons history, and the great Ernie May of Harvard ran the American team. And when I had to give my first talk on my dissertation, I was so nervous, and Ernie was trying to buck me up, and he said, "Nobody expects you to know anything. You can't possibly be a good historian until you're at least 40, because you simply haven't had time to read enough." And it was so, I felt so much better after he said that, because I was just being judged on potential. I wasn't being judged on talent. And it's really true, though, that the more history you read, the richer and deeper your appreciation of what is new and not new, of what are the conveyor belts that drive change. It's very easy without reading history to first of all think that because you see the sun in the sky in the middle of the day, it's news, but it's sun's in the sky in the middle of every day, right? And so history gives you context for what you see that's new versus what isn't. And of course, anybody who's read Ernie May's magnificent book, Thinking in Time, knows that for Washington policy people, dominating the selection of what is the historical analogy of this problem is the way to win the policy argument, right? You never want to be Neville Chamberlain at Munich. You always want to be Winston Churchill in front of Parliament.
Well said. Next project for you, obviously you have this new major commitment at IISS, but do you have a research area that you're particularly interested in now that you've completed this?
Yes, so I'm hesitant to say it out loud in a group of sharpshooters who might do a better job at it than I would do at it, but I want to write a book that looks at turbulence. Right? Because we're in such a turbulent moment for the United States, and there's a strong tendency on the part of lots of folks who aren't historians to say, technological innovation, everything's new, we've never experienced this kind of, fake news, and reckless politician. And one of the beautiful things about being a historian of 19th century America is that I can comfort you by saying we are not newly a country full of reckless people run by bad politicians. We are mostly that throughout American history, right?
So reassuring.
Abraham Lincoln is an outlier. The parade of American presidents in the 19th century is a parade of mediocrity. And yet our country mostly flourishes because of institutions and political culture. And I want to look at what I think are two interesting previous periods as tumultuous as what we are experiencing now. And those two periods are the 1820s and 30s, when the founding fathers passed from the scene, and it's, industrialization is beginning. It's a time of great technological innovation and a time of great economic upheaval. And you see it translate into American politics. And we find no effective means for buffering our society from it, and with the obvious consequence of the American Civil War. The 1890s, on the other hand, are another time of great technological innovation, huge immigration, political upheaval as a result. And it's the beginnings of unions, of antitrust legislation, and you get a period of creative experimentation by government to create buffers that defang some of the sharpest edges of politics. And I'd like to explore what might those look like in our contemporary context.
Fascinating. Okay, well, let's open it up to the audience for questions. We have mics that will come around, so when I call on you, if you can stand and say your name and affiliation and ask a question, please. Don't make a statement. And I have one right up here in the front.
Hi, my name's Andrew Lepsick. I'm a master's student at American and International Economics. Big fan of the Deep State podcast, by the way.
Deep State
so
nerd.
When I hear you talk about the transition, I'm reminded of Keynes's quote or speech about how the British Empire was just becoming too expensive for Britain, the mainland, to maintain. How much of the transition was just Britain saying, you know what, let's pick our battles, and this isn't one we want to fight? Thank you.
That is a fantastic question. And I have two suggestions to offer in response. The first is that you're right, and I talk about this in the book. In the 1880s, the British start wringing their hands about the cost of empire and about the military requirements to sustain it. I think the most insightful reflection on this comes from Aaron Friedberg, whose terrific book about the transition, Weary Titan, is the best thing going. He points out that it is actually technological innovation that makes Britain's empire unaffordable, namely the railroads, right? Because before you had safe, reliable ground transportation, Britain's control of the seas meant Britain controlled everybody's ability to reinforce any place they were trying to defend. Once you have the railroad, the Russians can move troops to Afghanistan, all these other things that drive the cost up hugely. So it's not that Britain didn't have the ability to sustain it, it's that the cost goes way up. Which takes me to the second point. The genius of the American-dominated international order is that we created rules and institutions and alliances that share the cost of our empire. We dramatically underestimate the magnetism of what the American order has on offer, right? Both institutions and norms that permit weak countries the protection of common defense, that give them a say over the rules that are going to bind the United States as well. It legitimates our power and it drives the cost down to our power, that we aren't just our power, right? The magnetism of our political culture and the deal we have on offer for people. So it pains me greatly to hear the president trashing not just America's allies, but America's alliances, because without them, what he is trying to achieve for our country gets so much harder to do, so much more expensive to do, and will get so much greater resistance by everybody else.
I'm just going to add, Kori has a great summation of Friedberg's book, The Weary Titan. This was terrifying to me when I read it. With regard to British retrenchment, the way you wrote it is, according to Friedberg, lacking the domestic discipline to develop internal consensus, to agree on and implement appropriate responses, the British chose to deceive themselves about the nature and magnitude of threats they were facing, which made me, as an American, slightly terrified.
Rings a little true,
yeah,
right?
Rings a little too close to home.
In year 7 of continuing resolutions.
Yes, yes. All right, we have a question almost to the back there, about the second or third row from the back. There you go.
Hi, I'm David Smith of The Guardian. Was a crucial factor in the peaceful nature of this transition that America didn't have the same ambitions of colonization beyond its own borders. So, for example, you didn't see sort of big pitched battles in Africa over control of territory. And if I can ask a second question, do you regard the eclipse of America by China as inevitable, or is it all still to play for?
Great questions, both. My answer to the first one is that the U.S. lacked the power to get involved in the scramble for colonies in the Middle East and Africa while that was up for grabs, right? When the Suez Canal's being built, we have 6 ships in the Caribbean. So the timing matters a lot on that. And I wish I could say that we would live our values so truly that we would have resisted the temptation, but American behavior in the Caribbean and Latin America belies that. So timing matters on that. Excuse me. The second question, I love. And I am skeptical that China can continue to grow prosperous without also liberalizing. Because it's so beautiful to see the millions of people lifted out of poverty by China's grudging openness of their economy. but they're not an open economy yet, right? And they are still a manufacturing and an extractive industries economy. And getting through the middle income trap to a service economy and to a creative economy is actually really hard. And we underestimate the difficulty of it because your country and my country are good at the infrastructure questions. So the best question anybody ever asked me about a rising China is, how large a population would it take to produce a university as good as Stanford, or to produce an ecosystem as dynamic as Silicon Valley? And the answer is, it takes the entire world's population, right? So the crucial question is 1 billion people good enough to create Silicon Valley? So far, the answer to that is no. And the reason that the United States has had the enormous, exorbitant privilege of Stanford and Silicon Valley is because we may not be everybody's first choice or second choice, but we're pretty high on the list of where, if you're a brilliant Argentinian software programmer and you don't want to live in Argentina, you might well come here, and especially because your children are going to grow up and run the country, right? One generation safely in the middle class is the absolute best innovation ticket that the United States has. And I don't think I see the Chinese mastering that dynamic. Moreover, as somebody who lives in Silicon Valley, the tiresome snowflake demandingness of those political consumers is integrally related to their creativity and exceptional brilliance. I think it is fundamentally true. I realize it's not stylish to say Frank Fukuyama was right, but I do still think Frank Fukuyama was right. And that it is inherently true that as people's basic needs become filled, they grow to be more demanding political consumers. And I don't see why the law of gravity won't apply in China. In fact, I think I already see it in people demanding safe baby milk and clean air and an end to corruption. And maybe the Chinese are smart enough that they can manage that without the elections and tiresome journalists holding government accountable, but it doesn't look to me like they can. So I think it likelier than not that either China liberalizes and becomes more prosperous, or it stops liberalizing and stops becoming more prosperous.
Great. Kevin's question right over here, second in from the second row.
So I'm Nancy Gallagher from the University of Maryland.
And yay, I'm an alum of that grade
yes,
school.
you both
As
are.
am I.
So
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a question about the comment that you made that this isn't the first time in our history that we've had a president who didn't have extensive experience and tended to act rather impulsively. And that we had lots of presidents like that in the 1900s, and basically our institutions saved us. Everything happens so much faster nowadays, right? And I'm wondering how you think that should shape the relationship between the individual who holds the presidency and the institutions that constrain that individual. Because on one hand, you can say, basically, we need to be able to operate much more quickly. We need to be able to be more decisive, to respond more quickly, et cetera. And so we have too many constraints. On the other hand, obviously, the consequences of getting it wrong are much, much, much more severe now than they were in the 1900s. So how do you use history to think about that question?
So in the mid-1990s, I remember marveling that American fighter pilots had this really innovative thing called a heads-up display, right? So in addition to looking at everything that they also had this other computer in front of them that they had to pay attention to. And I remember thinking, wow, it's got to take an enormous amount of training to be able to focus simultaneously. And yet, every Uber driver in the city now does that, right? One of my favorite Onion articles was, texting driver kills texting pedestrian. But in fact, it doesn't happen that often, right? Because all of us have adjusted to this new world where we are simultaneously doing 37 things. So, which is a long way around saying, I actually think the beauty of free societies is their malleability. And one of the great things about American society is we have a higher risk tolerance than almost any place else, right? Like, it's only kind of half chauvinism to say California is where the future gets invented, right? But that's kind of true, right? Silicon Valley is reshaping our politics. It's reshaping our consumer experiences. And we're experiencing the blunt force trauma of that right now in cultural change, in political change, in economic change. But I am, I think, more optimistic than you are about our capacity on a 5 and a 10-year time frame to figure that out. And I'm also quite confident that American institutions, because they leave so much to negotiation between the branches of government and between civil society forces and our government, right? Like, whenever we talk about a Goldwater-Nichols for the interagency to make it work well, or strategic communications where we're all going to be on the same sheet of music, I always laugh up my sleeve because we're incapable of those things, right? We are a government created by people who distrust the centralization and efficient working of power, because it removes the need to build broad political consensus for change. The building of that broad political consensus is ghastly to watch and to participate in, but that's what we do. And that's where the solution to those problems is going to come, not in the reshaping of institutions or the slowing of this hair-raising roller coaster ride of innovation we're in the middle of right now.
Okay, great. Let's see. I've got one all the way in the back there.
My name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm one of the few people in the room who's not an academic. I work with private equity in the technology sector and have worked with people in the finance and business in China for quite a long time. I have one macro and one micro question. The macro question is, I would say among those Chinese that I've worked with over the decades who have thought about what we now call the Thucydides trap, probably the most clearly thought out perspective is that you Americans have it wrong. We are not interested in being a world power like you are. You can have Europe, you can have South America. What we want is, and one of them put it very succinctly, what we want to do in the 21st century is what the United States did in the 19th century. At the beginning of the century, you had England to the north, Spain to the south, French to the west. You were surrounded. By the end, they were all gone. We, as he put it, want Japan and Korea to be our Canada and Indochina to be our Mexico. Right. They never oppose us. And another, just a small thing,
right.
Could you comment on the British admiral?
What Korea and Japan want.
Well, you might say that about the people of Canada too.
Where is the question, though? Is
the
it
question
whether that resonates?
What is your perspective, since we've talked so much about the Thucydides and China issue, is your perspective that the Chinese do not seek to be a global hegemon, but a regional hegemon, which is a widespread view in China,
it's a very
and changes the dynamic if you look at it that way?
It's a very interesting question, but I think irrelevant. And the reason it's irrelevant is because if the United States permits the Chinese a version of the Monroe Doctrine, ceding our alliance relationships and affectionate regard for Japan, Korea, Australia, increasingly Vietnam, the Philippines, then it won't matter, right? Because China will have changed the rules of the order, and we will no longer be enforcing the rules that not just we want, but that the Japanese want, the Koreans want, the Australians want, right? This is the problem for the Chinese order, that it's actually going to be a very expensive one to establish because nobody wants it but them. And the brilliance of the American order is, the dirty little secret is, almost everybody wants us to succeed, because what is good for us by the rules we have established is also good for them. And that's what the Chinese haven't found a way to do yet. And maybe the One Belt One Road initiative will be it, but not if Sri Lanka starts shooting out Chinese office buildings in the country because China has forcibly taken over their port for debt, for resolving debt.
Mike.
Hi, Mike McDevitt. The last 3 questions or 4 questions in your responses have been brilliant. Can I drag it back to history for just a second? You didn't mention the fact that Great Britain was essentially bankrupted in World War I and then doubly bankrupted in World War II to the point where they had no choice but to gracefully withdraw from the stage. Does your book cover that?
Yeah, I talk a lot about the economics of World War I. And I think the decision by Britain to allow the United States, the set of rules the United States is wearing, I think that transition precedes it. It occurs in 1895 during the Venezuelan debt crisis. But it wasn't clear to either the British or the Americans at the end of World War I that British hegemony couldn't be reconstructed out of the ashes, right? It wasn't a foregone conclusion that Britain wasn't going to build itself back into, or that any other country wasn't going to. The US was their banker, but we were also a very indulgent banker. And the British were constantly fearful that we were going to tie the terms, in particular, to the end of their colonial trade preferences, right? Because that was their model for economic reconstruction, the preferential trading within the British colonies. And in fact, we did permit it. We give Britain Germany's choicest colonies coming out of World War I, and we permit the continuation of the trading regime. So we could have been a lot harder on the British than we were. The point at which we stopped giving the British rules of their own, though, is visible by the Washington Naval Accords in 1921 to 23. Right? That's the point in time at which the British say, but wait, we have a 3-ocean navy. We need a 3-ocean navy. You don't. We should have a bigger allotment in naval shipping than you do. And we were powerful enough at that point to flat out refuse. And that in fact, the French and the Italians and the Japanese all get concessions that we aren't willing to give the British. So that's the point at which we stopped caring about their special rules. One amusing thing I found in the research for the book, it's my favorite little fingerprint of it. So we required the British to cut down the size of 2 classes of ships, the hulls of several of which had already been laid. And the Royal Navy calls those the George Washington classes because Washington cut them down. It was so cute.
Okay, I have a question right here. No, I'm sorry, in the first of the 2. But why don't we just pair them? If you pass your mic back, we'll make Kori do double duty here.
Excellent. Thank you for an excellent talk. My name is Max Kelly. I'm with Booz Allen Hamilton. So you talked about the importance of political liberalism and how it played a role in constraining, both constraining American power as America rose, somewhat inconsistently, but also the way that, it seems to me, the way that the Brits and other powers even appealed to political liberalism at times and pointed out contradictions in ways, certainly during the Civil War and later.
Yeah.
What strikes me today, though, is that many of the states, including some of the ones you mentioned, that are looking to America to enforce the rules, are looking for a very particular version in which they get some exemptions from that political liberalism as well. And so it puts them kind of on the fence between, there's an appeal to the Chinese model. For example, Vietnam. They will liberalize, but up to a point, if you watch what's going on in Cambodia now. So my question to you is, how do you see this sort of the role of political liberalism and perhaps waning faith in it as a model not just in China, but elsewhere, as influencing how power is constrained in the future?
It's a fantastic question.
Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? We'll add them together.
Thank you, Pete Frost, retired gratefully. Your talks properly focused prospectively on China as the ascending power. I wonder if you had any thoughts on Russia as a potential declining power and how that will play out on the world stage.
Yeah, both excellent questions. So on the role of political liberalism, one of the big attractions of the American order is that countries grow prosperous and they grow more peaceful, right? Because you have security guarantees, you have the United States adjudicating your problems alongside you, and the prosperity that comes with free markets. So the reason China is such an interesting test case is because for the last 40 years, it has been an outlier to that model. And so all of us are scrambling to look at this great political science experiment and think, is the law of gravity gonna sooner or later apply to China? Political liberalism, if it does not produce prosperity for people, will be diminished in its attractiveness, right? If it were possible to grow prosperous broadly and sustainably in a country without political liberalism, a whole lot of countries wouldn't do it, not just Vietnam and Cambodia. So the Chinese model is especially tempting for authoritarians, which is why the policies that the Trump administration has taken that blur that line are disadvantageous to us as well as disadvantageous to others. But I am confident that the liberal order that the United States established is robust enough to sustain itself through the activism of other countries in the liberal order for a pretty substantial period of time while the United States has this domestic argument about our role in the world. I would offer as an example for you the way that Australia, Japan, and South Korea are pushing the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership forward, even with absent American participation, Canada as well. The way the Canadians are brilliantly playing in American domestic politics to have agreements on trade with states and cities and to get around a federal government that is hostile to what they're trying to achieve. Right? The liberal order is malleable in ways that free states know how to manipulate as well. We're very much focused on the way authoritarian states are playing in our domestic politics, but liberal states, our friends and allies, are actually the ones best at it. And I think I see that happening in a way that I'm pretty confident can sustain the order for a decade at least, while we get our own domestic house in order. On the Russia case, they're a threat to us through our weakness, not through their strength. And I am unflinching in my defense of the American government's policy towards Russia since 1991. Because I think we have always had open to them the same offer we have had open to China, the same offer we have had open to Lithuania, the same offer we have had open to Spain in the 1980s, which is, come on in, the water's fine, right? If you are a society that respects the rights of individuals and believes that individuals loan those rights in limited ways to their government for specific purposes, if you conduct your economy in a way that is transparent and open to negotiated trade with others, right? The main frame of the American international order, we have so many times encouraged the Russians to opt into, and they have chosen not to, whether because the leadership is a mafia state or the society didn't believe it could succeed on those terms. I don't know enough to make a judgment, but they have consistently opted out of the order and defined themselves in opposition to the order. So I don't think we just have a Putin problem. I think we have a Russia problem. And maybe it will attenuate if the Russians find a way to succeed and on the terms that others have succeeded in the liberal order. Or maybe they will resign themselves to being something other than a great power in the order. Or maybe they will lose the ability to do either of those things. But yeah, we should be worried about the Russians.
Okay, last question. I think we had one right here. Yes. Did you not? I thought you had your hand up. Okay.
Uh-oh,
Yes?
Sharpshooter.
Yep.
Never
Had to
take
have
the
one
last
in there.
question, Kath.
I would hear about it if I didn't take this question.
No, it's fine.
It's always your friends who do you damage, not your enemies. I'm braced up. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Mika Oyang with Third Way. Kori, you defined the hegemon as the person who sets the global rules. And what you see in China is sort of a talking about the rules, but not necessarily a culture of rule of law and rules enforcement. At the same time, you see the Chinese sending far more people to international rule-setting bodies in much larger delegations. What's your sense of whether or not China will, in fact, make a turn to a rule of law, rules-based society, and in fact cares about that global rule-setting role, or are they still going to get stuck in this autocratic approach to hegemony?
It is the trillion-dollar question. I think the current Chinese government is putting people in international rule-setting institutions in order to change the rules, right? Not to learn the rules, not to figure out how to put top spin on the ball, but to make sure that the court of arbitration wouldn't find against the Chinese next time they seize Philippine Islands. That's what I think they're trying to do. Maybe it will be the case that they will get socialized by all of those earnest Dutch women and men and Finns who are, right? Because the great advantage the American order has is it doesn't just require us to be its perpetuators, right? The other countries who see themselves as beneficiaries actually carry an enormous amount of the load of upholding the rules, shaming us when we fail them, and showing everybody else how you can succeed in this operating system. So I'm skeptical the Chinese are doing it for virtuous motives. I'm 10% hopeful that participation in it will socialize them to behave like everybody else. I'm 90% optimistic that the domestic pressures in China for accountability are going to change the nature of that government over time.
Dr. Kori Schake, book, Safe Passage. You are always welcome to stop in the swamps of Washington, whether you're on the innovative side of the west coast of the US or the sophisticated across the ocean, across the pond land of England. And we thank you for coming today. Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. I appreciate it.